Hello, this is Chiak. We are, excuse me, I'm still trying to fix my hair. Hello, this is Chiak. We are back with the cold reading of Resident Evil, Volume 6, Code Veronica, novelized by S.D Perry. You know what? I was wondering. I can't hear myself. That's why. So let me just plug this. Let me just plug this in. There we go. I was wondering why. It's like, how come everything sounds so different? Okay, so as I was able to parse out the chapters in the book, which very strangely, the very latter chapters are extremely short. So I already know that I think chapter just 2 and 3, because 3 actually looks a bit lengthy. So we are just going to be reading these 2 chapters for today. Also, I started way later than I wanted to. Hey. All right. Resident Evil, Code Veronica by S.D Perry, Chapter 2. Claire snapped the lighter closed at the base of the covered stairs and took a deep breath, trying to psych herself up for whatever came next. The chill of the dark corridor behind her pressed at her back like an icy hand, but still she hesitated, the knife half sweaty beneath her fingers as she slipped the warm lighter into her vest pocket. She wasn't particularly looking forward to ascending into the unknown, but she had nowhere else to go, not unless she meant to go back to the cell. She could smell oily smoke, and she guessed that the flickering shadows at the top of the white cement steps meant fire. But what's up there? This is an umbrella facility. What if it was like Raccoon City? What if the attack on the island had unleashed a virus, or some of the animal abominations that Umbrella kept creating? Or was Rockfort only a prison for their enemies? Maybe the prisoners had rioted. Maybe things had only been bad from Rodrigo's point of view. Maybe you could walk up the goddamn stairs and find out instead of guessing all day, Her pulse thumping, Claire forced herself to take the first step, vaguely wondering why movies always made it seem so easy to bravely throw oneself into probable danger. After Raccoon, she knew better. Maybe she didn't have much of a choice about what she had to do, but that didn't mean she wasn't scared. Considering the circumstances, only a complete moron wouldn't be afraid. She climbed slowly, opening her senses as new adrenaline flushed her system, replaying the brief glimpse she had of the small graveyard when the guards had led her through. No help there. She'd only seen a few headstones, remembered them as bizarrely ornate for a prison cemetery. There was definitely a fire close to the top of the stairs, but apparently not a big one. There was no heat filtering down, only a cool and humid breeze that carried the pervasive smoke smell. It seemed quiet, and as she neared the top, she heard drops of rain hissing as they met the flames, an oddly comforting sound. As she emerged from the stairwell, she saw the source of the fire only meters away. A helicopter had crashed, a large portion of it merrily burning amid a thick, smoky haze. A large portion of it merrily burning amid a thick, smoking haze. To her left was a wall, another just past the flaming wreck. To her right, the open space of the cemetery, gloomy and shrouded by the increasing rain and the oncoming night. Claire squinted into the rainy dusk and made out a number of dark shapes. Though none of them seemed to be moving, more headstones, she thought. A whisper of relief edged through her anxiety. Whatever had happened seemed to be over. Amazing, she thought. that she could possibly be relieved to be alone in a cemetery at night. Even 6 months ago, her imagination would have conjured up all sorts of horrible things. It appeared that ghosts and cursed souls just didn't cut it on the scary meter anymore. Not after her run ins with Umbrella. She took a right on the U shaped path, moving slowly, remembering how she'd been led through the graveyard before being pushed to the stairs. She, she thought she could make out what looked like a gate past the line of graves in the center of the yard, or at least an open space in the far wall, and suddenly she was flying. The sound of an explosion behind her assaulting her ears. Whoomp. A wave of broiling heat throwing her into the mud. The wet twilight was suddenly brighter, the reek of burning chemicals stinging her nose and eyes. She landed without grace but managed to not stab herself with a combat knife. All of it happening so fast that she barely had time to register confusion. Don't think I'm hurt. The helicopter's fuel tank must have blown. Claire was on her feet instantly, the soft, pitiful, unmistakable moan inspiring a near panic of action. The sound joined by another and another. She spun around and saw the first one stumbling toward her from what was left of the burning helicopter. A man, his clothes and hair on fire, the skin of his face blistering and black. She turned again and saw two more of them crawling up from the mud, their faces a sickening gray-white, their skeletal fingers grasping in her direction, clutching air as they reeled towards her. Shit. Just as in Raccoon, Umbrella's viral synthesis had effectively turned them into zombies, stealing their humanity and their lives. She didn't have time for disbelief or dismay. Not with three of them closing in. Not when she realized that there were others farther along the path. They staggered out from the shadows, slack, brutalized faces, all turning slowly toward her, mouths hanging open, their gazes blank and unchanging. Some wore shreds of uniforms, camo or plain gray, guards and prisoners. There had been a spill, after all. The overlapping cries epitomized great longing. Each plaintive wail, that of a starving man looking at a feast. Goddamn Umbrella for what they'd done. It was beyond tragic. The transformation from human into mindless dying creatures, decaying as they walked. The inevitable fate of each virus carrier was death, but she couldn't let herself mourn for them. Not now. Her pity limited by the need to survive. I got this page is from. Go now. Her assessment and analysis lasted less than a second, and then she was moving. No plan except to get away. With the path blocked in both directions, she leapt for the center of the graveyard, clambering over the marble slabs that marked the resting places of the true dead. Her wet, muddy jeans clung to her legs, hampering her, her boots slipping against the smooth headstones, but she managed to climb up and balance her weight between two of them, out of reach for the moment. For the second, you gotta get out of here fast. Excuse me. The knife was no good. She didn't dare get close enough to use it. A single healthy bite from one of those things, and she'd end up joining their ranks, if they didn't eat her first. The one with the blackened face was nearest, his hair melted away, part of his shirt still smoldering. He was close enough for her to smell the greasy, nauseating smell of burnt flesh, overlaid by the stench of the fuel that had cooked it. She had 15 seconds at most before he'd be close enough to grab for her. She shot a glance at the southeast corner of the yard, her arms out for balance. There were only two of them between her and the exit, But that was too many. She'd never make it past both of them. She knew from Raccoon they were slow and that their reasoning skills were a zip. They saw prey, they moved toward it in a straight line, regardless of what was in the way. If she could just bait them away from the gate. Good idea. Except there were too many on the ground, 6 or 7 of them. She ended up surrounded. But not if you stay on the headstones. There were multiple zombies to either side of the center row of graves, but only one standing at the end of the line directly in front of her. And that one barely functional, an eye gouged out, an arm broken and hanging. It was a risky plan. One stumble and she was toast, but the burned man was already reaching for her ankle with his charred and shaking hands, rain sizzling on his upturned face. Claire leaped, arms wheeling as she landed with both feet on the narrow top of the next stone slab in line. She started to pitch forward, jerking and swiveling her body to maintain her center of gravity. But it was no good. She was going to fall. Without thinking, she quickly jumped again, and then again, using the uneven stones like rocks in a river, using her lack of balance to propel her forward. An ashen-faced virus carrier snatched at her lower legs, moaning in feverish hunger. But she was already past it, leaping to the next headstone. Leaping to the next headstone. She didn't have time to consider how she was going to stop, which was just as well, because the unlikely path ran out one jump later, and her next leap was into a sloppy shoulder rolled against the muddy ground a meter below. Ooh, a hard drop, but she followed through and came up on her feet, just barely, her legs sliding unsteadily in the muck. The one-eyed zombie lurched toward her, gurgling, within easy reach, but she quickly stumbled around it, keeping on its blind side, the knife ready. The creature attempted to turn to find its meal once more, but she easily stayed out of its limited sight. She risked a glance away from her awkward, shuffling dance and saw the other zombies closing in. The rain intensified, sluicing the mud off of her. It's working. Just another few seconds. Frustrated by its lack of success, the half-blinded carrier pawed at the air with its one good arm, the dirty, blackened nails scraping across her chest, and the zombie moaned anxiously, scrabbling at the wet denim, but it couldn't get a solid grip. God, it's touching me. With a wordless cry of fear and disgust, Claire slashed out with a knife, deep, nearly bloodless cuts opening across its wrist. The zombie continued to clutch at her, oblivious to the damage she was doing as it staggered closer, and Claire decided that it was time to leave. She pulled her arms back, hands fisted, and then drove them forward into the creature's chest, pushing as hard as she could. She turned again to the center line of graves as the creature fell backward, the others much closer now. How she managed to climb back up so quickly, she didn't know. 1 second she was on the ground, the next she was on top of beveled granite. She saw the exit was clear, the zombies now loosely grouped near the west wall. Her hopping second journey along the headstones was only slightly more controlled than the first, each leap like a leap of faith. But she wouldn't slip and seriously injure herself. The rain was tapering off, and she could hear the wet, sucking sounds of their plodding, slow-motion chase clearly. Unless one of them suddenly remembered how to jog, they were too far away to catch up to her. Now, I just have to pray that the door isn't secured, she thought dizzily, jumping down from the last headstone. The gate was standing open, but the door just past it wasn't. If it turned out to be locked, she was probably doomed. Three giant strides from where she landed, she was through the gate and reaching for the handle of a dented metal door. The exit set into the stone wall. It clicked open smoothly, and she held the knife ready, hoping that if there were more carriers on the other side, at least the odds might be better. Behind her, the chemical cannibals lamented their loss, moaning loudly as she stepped through. Some kind of courtyard, piled with pieces of random wreckage, overlooked by a low guard tower. There was an overturned transport vehicle to her left, a low fire burning inside. The night was coming on quickly, but the moon was also rising, either full or close to it, and as she secured the door behind her, she could see there was no immediate danger. No zombies headed toward her, anyway. There were several bodies strewn about, none of them moving, and she mentally crossed her fingers that at least one of them had a gun and some ammo. A brilliant light suddenly snapped on, a spotlight on the guard tower, the force of it instantly blinding her, and as she instinctively looked away, the whining chatter of automatic fire broke out. Bullets splashing in the mud at her feet. Blind and panicked, Claire dove for cover, the random thought that she might have been better off in that cell repeating itself through her terror. So let's take a drink of water. The fighting had been over for some time. The last gunshots maybe an hour past. But Steve Burnside thought he might stay where he was for a while, just in case. Besides, it was still raining a little, a bitter ocean wind picking up. The guard tower was safe and dry, no dead people and no zombies wandering around, and he'd be able to see anyone coming in plenty of time to head them off, with a little help from the machine gun mounted on the window ledge. Of course, a seriously kick-ass weapon. He'd have mowed down all the courtyard zombies without breaking a sweat. He had a handgun too, a 9mm semi that he'd taken off one of the past tense guards, which also kicked ass, though not quite as much. So, hang in there another hour or so, assuming it doesn't start pouring again, and go find a way off this rock. He thought he could handle a plane. He'd been in cockpits enough, but he thought a boat might be better. Not as far to fall if he screwed the pooch, so to speak. Steve leaned casually against the cement window ledge, looking out over the moonlit courtyard, wondering if he should try to find a kitchen before ditching out. The guards hadn't gone around to serving lunch, being as how they were all dying, and it seemed they didn't stock the tower room with donuts or whatever. He'd already looked. He was starving. Maybe I should head for Europe. Get myself some international cuisine. I can go anywhere I want now. Anywhere at all. There's nothing holding me back. The thought was supposed to get him excited for all the possibilities, but it didn't. It made him feel anxious and kind of weird, so he went back to considering his escape. The main gate that led out of the prison was locked down, but he figured if he searched enough guards, he'd find one of the emblem keys. He'd already run across the warden, the late Paul Steiner, but all his keys were gone. So was most of his face, Steve thought, not particularly unhappy about it. Steiner had been a serious dick, strutting around like he was King Turd of Shit Mountain, always smiling when another prisoner got led off to the infirmary. And nobody ever came back from the infirmary. Snick. Steve froze, staring at the metal door straight across from the tower. The graveyard was on the other side, and he knew for a fact it was full of zombies. He'd sneaked a look right after plugging the courtyard. He sneaked a look right after plugging the courtyard corpses. Jesus. Could they open doors? They were walking vegetables, mush brains. They weren't supposed to be able to open doors. And if they could do that, what else were they capable of? Don't panic. You got the machine gun, remember? All the other prisoners were dead. If it was a person, he or she was no friend of his, and if it wasn't human or a zombie, he'd be putting it out of its misery. Either way, he wasn't going to hesitate, and he wasn't going to be afraid. Fear was for pussies. Steve grabbed this. Sorry, he's making me laugh. Steve grabbed for the searchlight handle with his right hand, his left already on the trigger guard of the heavy black rifle. As the door swung open, he swallowed dryly and snapped the light on, firing as soon as he had the target pinned down. The weapon rattled out a stream of bullets, the handle jouncing against his hand, rounds kicking up tiny fountains of mud. He caught a glimmer of something pink, a shirt maybe, and then his target was diving out of the line of fire, moving way too fast to be one of the cannibals. He heard about some of the monsters Umbrella had cooked up, and machine gun or no, he hoped to God he wasn't about to meet one of them. I'm not afraid. I'm not. He tracked right with the searchlight and kept firing, a sudden anxious sweat on his brow. The person or thing was behind the protruding wall near the base of the tower, out of sight. But if he couldn't kill it, he could at least scare it away. Cement chips flew, the high-intensity beam illuminating the lower half of a dead prison guard, mud and debris, but no target. And there was a lightning flash of motion from behind the wall, a glimpse of pale upturned face. Bam, bam, bam! And the searchlight shattered. White-hot chunks of glass sprang across the tower room floor. Steve let out an involuntary yell as he jumped back from the machine gun. Somebody was shooting at him, and he didn't care if it was a pussy. He was about to shit his pants. "Don't shoot!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "I give!" It was dead silent for a few seconds, and then the cool female voice came out of the dark, low and somehow amused. "Say uncle." Steve blinked, uncertainly, confused, and then remembered how to breathe again, feeling his cheeks go red as the fear fell away. "I give. That was totally lame. So much for first impressions." "I'm coming down," he said, relieved that his voice didn't break this time, deciding that anyone who could make a joke after being shot at couldn't be all bad. If she was the enemy, he had the 9mm. But friendly or not, there was no way he was going to ask her not to shoot again. That would just make him look worse. And it's a girl. Maybe a pretty one. He did his best to ignore the thought. No point in getting his hopes up. For all he knew, she was 98, bald, and smoked cigars. But even if she wasn't, even if she was a total hottie, he didn't want to end up taking responsibility for any life besides his own. Screw that shit. He was free now. Having someone count on you was almost as bad as having to depend on others. The thought was uncomfortable. He pushed it aside. Anyway, the circumstances weren't exactly romantic. What with a bunch of diseased monsters running wild and death around every corner. Gross, slimy death, too. The kind with maggots and pus. Steve took the steps to the courtyard 2 at a time, his eyes adjusting to the post-searchlight dark as he stepped out to meet her. She stood in the center of the courtyard, a gun in hand, and as he got closer, it was all he could do not to stare. She was muddy and wet and about the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, her face like a model's, big eyes and fine, even features, reddish hair in a dripping ponytail. An inch or two shorter than him, and about the same age, he thought. He'd be 18 in a couple of months, and she couldn't be much older. She wore jeans, boots, and a sleeveless pink vest over a tight black half-tee, her flat stomach showing, the entire outfit accentuating her lean, athletic body. And although she looked tired and weary, her gray-blue eyes sparkled brightly. "Say something cool. Play it cool no matter what. Steve wanted to tell her he was sorry about firing at her, to tell her who he was and what happened during the attack, to say something suave and worldly and interesting. You're not a zombie, he blurted out, and really cursing even as it came out. Brilliant. No shit, she said mildly, and he suddenly realized that her weapon was pointing at him. She held it low, but she was definitely aiming it. Even as he froze, she took a step back and raised the gun, watching him closely, her finger under the trigger guard and the muzzle only inches from his face. And who the hell are you? The kid smiled. If he was nervous, he was doing a good job of not letting it show. Claire didn't take her finger off the trigger, but she was already half convinced that he was no threat to her. She'd shot out the light, but he easily could have strafed the yard and taken her down. Strapped? She shot out the light, but he easily could have strafed the yard and taken her down. Relax, beautiful, he said, still smiling. My name's Steve Burnside. I was a prisoner here. Beautiful? Oh, great. Nothing annoyed her more than being patronized. On the other hand, he was obviously younger than her, which probably meant he was trying to assert his manliness, to be a man rather than a boy. In her experience, there were few things more obnoxious than someone trying to be something they weren't. He looked her up and down, obviously checking her out, and she took another step back, the gun unwavering. She wasn't going to take any chances. The weapon was an M93R, an Italian 9mm, an excellent handgun and apparently standard issue for the prison guards. Chris had one of them. She found it after diving for cover next to the dead, outstretched finger of a man in uniform. And if she shot the young Mr. Burnside with it at this range, most of his handsome face would be on the ground. He looked like an actor she'd seen before, the lead in that movie about the sinking ship. The resemblance was striking. I'm guessing you're not from Umbrella either, he said casually. I'm sorry about opening up on you like that, by the way. I didn't think there was anyone else alive around here, so when the door opened... He shrugged. Anyway, he said, cocking an eyebrow, obviously trying to be charming. What's your name? There was no way Umbrella had hired this kid. She was more sure of it with each word out of his mouth. She slowly lowered the semi-automatic, wondering why Umbrella would want to imprison someone so young. They wanted to imprison you, remember? She was only 19. Claire Redfield, she said. I was brought here as a prisoner just today. Talk about timing, Steve said, and she had to smile a little at that. She'd been thinking the same thing herself. Claire, that's a nice name, he continued, looking into her eyes. I'll definitely remember that. Oh, brother. She wondered if she should shut him down now or later. She and Leon had gotten pretty tight and decided that later might be better. There was no question that she'd have to take him with her to look for an escape, and she didn't want to deal with his reproach along the way. Well, as much as I'd like to hang around, I've got a plane to catch, he said, sighing melodramatically, assuming I can find one. I'll look for you before I take off. Be careful, this place is dangerous. He started toward a door next to the guard tower, directly opposite from the one she'd come through. Catch you later. She was so surprised that she almost couldn't find her voice in time. Was he nuts? Or just stupid? He was at the door before she spoke up, jogging after him. Steve, wait! We should stick together! He turned and shook his head, his expression incredibly condescending. I don't want you following me, okay? No offense? Well, you'll just slow me down. He smiled winningly again, working the eye contact as hard as he could. And you definitely be a distraction. Look, just keep your eyes and ears open. You'll be fine. He was through the door and gone before she could say anything. Dumbfounded and thoroughly annoyed, she watched the door settle closed, wondering how he had survived so far. His attitude suggested that he thought this was just one big video game where he couldn't possibly get hurt or killed. It appeared that sheer bravado counted for something, the one thing teenage boys seem to have in abundance. That and, that and testosterone. Tes- Testosterone, sorry, I suddenly can't say that word. That and testosterone. If being perceived as cool was his main concern, he wasn't going to make it very far. She'd had to go after him. She'd had to go after him. She couldn't leave him to die. The terrible, lonely, ferocious sound that suddenly shattered the still night was one she heard before in Raccoon City, and it was coming from behind the door that Steve had just gone through. There was no mistaking it for anything else. A dog infected by the T virus turned from a domestic animal into a ruthless killer. After a fast search of the dead guards in the courtyard, she had two more full clips and parts of a third. As ready as she was going to get, Claire took a few deep breaths and then slowly pushed the door open with a 9mm with the 9mm barrel, hoping that Steve Burnside would stay lucky until she found him, and that by meeting him, her own luck hadn't just taken a serious turn for the worse. Okay. So we meet the other character. That was the end of chapter 2. And then we're going to start the next chapter 3, which definitely looks to be a bit longer. Sorry, I'm like trying to figure out. It's very awkward. Here we go. Maybe this will be better. Chapter 3. As terrible and disheartening as the destruction to Rockfort was, Alfred couldn't deny that he enjoyed putting down a few of his subordinates on the way to the training facility's main control room. He had no idea how gratifying it would be to see them sick and dying, reaching for him in hunger. The same men who'd sneered at him behind his back, who'd call him abnormal, who had pretended allegiance with their fingers crossed and then expiring by his hand. There were listening devices and hidden cameras throughout the compound, installed by his own paranoid father. A hidden monitor room in the private residence. Alfred had known all along that he wasn't liked, that the Umbrella employees feared but didn't respect him as he deserved. And now it didn't matter, he thought, smiling. Stepping out of the elevator to see John Barton at the other end of the hall, staggering toward him with outstretched arms. Barton had been responsible for training Umbrella's growing militia in small arms, at least at the Rockfort compound, and had been a loud, vulgar barbarian, swaggering around with his cheap cigars, flexing his ridiculously bloated muscles, always sweating, always laughing. The pale, blood-drenched creature stumbling toward him bore little resemblance, but was undoubtedly the same man. "You're not laughing anymore, Mr. Barton," Alfred said lightly, raising his I don't know how to say this, 22 rifle? Raising his 22 rifle, using the sight to pull a tiny red dot over the trainer's bloodshot left eye. The drooling, moaning Barton didn't notice. Bam! Although he surely would have appreciated Alfred's excellent aim and choice of ammunition. The 22 was loaded with safety slugs, rounds designed to spread out on impact. Designated safe because the bullets wouldn't go through the target and injure anyone else. Alfred's shot Alfred's shot obliterated Barton's eye and certainly a goodly part of his brain, rendering him harmless and quite dead. The large man crumpled to the ground, a puddle of blood spurting out beneath him. Some of the bows were unnerving to him, and he was relieved that most had either been locked down in various parts of the train, and he was relieved that most had been and he was relieved that most had either been locked down in various parts of the training facility or had been killed outright. He certainly wouldn't be wandering around if there were more than a few on the loose, but he didn't find the virus carriers to be particularly frightening. Alfred had seen many men, and a number of women as well, turned into these zombie like creatures by way of the T virus, experiments that he'd witnessed throughout his childhood, that he directed himself as an adult. In fact, there were never more than 50 or 60 prisoners living at Rockfort at a time. Between Dr. Stoker, the anatomist and researcher who worked at the anatomist between Dr. Stoker, the anatomist, and the researcher who worked at the infirmary, and the constant need for training targets and spare parts, no one incarcerated at the compound enjoyed Umbrella's hospitality. My God, I'm suddenly having trouble with this chapter. It's also getting darker and it's making it a bit harder to read. I'm going to take it back. In fact, there were never more than 50 or 60 prisoners living at Rockfort at a time. Between Dr. Stoker, the anatomist, and researcher who worked at the infirmary, and the constant need for training targets and spare parts, no one incarcerated at the compound enjoyed Umbrella's hospitality for more than 6 months. And where will we all be 6 months from now, I wonder? Alfred stepped over Barton's swollen corpse, walking toward the control room to call his Umbrella HQ contacts. Would Umbrella choose to rebuild at Rockfort? Would he agree to it? He and Alexia had been perfectly safe from the virus during its hot stage. Both pathways between the rest of the facility and their private home locked down throughout most of the air attack. But knowing that Umbrella's nameless enemy was willing to resort to such extreme measures, did he really want to risk refitting a laboratory so near their home? The Ashfords feared nothing, but neither were they reckless. Alexia would never agree to closing the facility, not now, not when she's so close to her goal. Alfred stopped in his tracks, staring at the banks of radio and video equipment, at the blank computer screen that stared back at him with wide, dead eyes. He stared but didn't see, a strange emptiness opening up inside of him, confusing him. Where was Alexia? What goal? She's gone. Gone. She's gone. It was true. He could feel it in his bones. But how could she leave him? How could she when she knew that she was his heart, that he would die without her? The monstrosity screaming and blind, a failure, and it was cold, so cold the queen ant naked, suspended in the sea, and he couldn't touch her, could only feel the cold, unyielding glass beneath his longing fingers. Alfred gasped, the nightmare imagery so real, so horrid that he didn't know where he was, didn't know what he was doing. Distantly, he felt his hands clenching tighter and tighter around something, the muscles of his arms shaking, and there was a burst of static from the console in front of him, loud and crackling, and Alfred realized that somebody was speaking. Please, if anyone can hear me, this is Dr. Mario Tika in the second floor lab. The voice was saying, breaking with fear. I'm locked in, and all the tanks have gone down. They're waking up. Please, you have to help me. I'm not infected. I'm in the suit, swear to God. You gotta get me out of here. Dr. Tika locked in the embryo tank room. Tika, who had long been sending private reports to Umbrella about his progress with the Albunoid project, secret reports that were different from the ones he showed Alfred. Alexia had suggested that Tika be sent to Dr. Stoker some months ago. Wouldn't she be amused to hear him now? Alfred reached over and turned off Tika's babbling plea, suddenly feeling much better. Alexia had warned him time and again about his peculiar episodes, the flashes of intense loneliness and confusion. Stress, she insisted, telling him that he was not to take them seriously, that she would never leave him voluntarily. She loved him too much for that. Thinking of her, thinking of all the trouble and pain that Umbrella's incompetent defenses had brought about for both of them. Thinking of her, thinking of all the trouble and pain that Umbrella's incompetent defenses had brought about for them both, Alfred abruptly decided not to place his uplink call. HQ had certainly heard about the attack by now, and would be sending a cleanup crew soon enough. Really, there was no need to speak with them. Besides, they didn't deserve to hear his observations of the situation, to have his foreknowledge of the danger they'd be facing. He was no employee, no ignorant lackey who had to report to his superiors. The Ashfords had created Umbrella. They should be reporting to him. I did speak to Jackson only a week ago about the Redfield girl. Alfred felt his eyes widen, his mind working madly. Claire Redfield, sister to Chris Redfield, he of the meddlesome Stars holdouts, had arrived mere hours before the attack. She had been caught in Paris, inside Umbrella's HQ administration building, claiming to be searching for her brother. And they sent her to him to keep her locked up while they decided what to do with her. But what if the plan had been to lure her brother out into the open, to crush his ridiculous insurrection once and for all, a plan they'd conveniently forgotten to tell him? And what if she'd been followed to Rockfort by Redfield and his comrades? Her very presence a signal for them to attack. Or perhaps even allowed herself to be captured in the first place. It was as if a puzzle was falling into place. Of course she had. Clever girl. She'd played her part well. Whether or not Umbrella had unwittingly encouraged the attack didn't matter. Not now. He would deal with her. He would deal with them later. What mattered was that the Redfield witch had brought the enemy to Rockfort, and she might still be alive. Stealing information, spying, perhaps even planning to hurt his Alexia. No, he breathed, the fear immediately transforming into fury. Obviously, that had been her plan all along, to do as much damage to Umbrella as possible, and Alexia was undoubtedly the brightest scientific mind working in bioweapons research, perhaps the brightest in any field. Claire wouldn't get away with it. He'd find her, or better yet, wait for her to come to him, as she surely would. He could watch for her, lay in wait like a hunter the girl, his prey. And why kill her immediately, when you could have so much fun with her first? It was Alexia's voice in his thoughts, reminding him of their childhood games, the pleasure they'd shared in their own experiments, creating environments of pain, watching things suffer and die. It had forged the bond between them in steel, to share such intimate things. I can't keep her alive. I can keep her alive. Let Alexia play with her. Or better, I could invent a maze for her. See how she fares against some of our pets. There were many possibilities. With few exceptions, Alfred could unlock the doors on the island by computer. He could easily lead her wherever he wanted. and kill her at his discretion. Claire Redfield had underestimated him. They all had, but no more. And if things worked out, the way Alfred was starting to hope, the day would end on a much happier note than the dismal discord which had marked its beginning. If there were infected dogs roaming the grounds, they were hiding. The open yard Claire stepped into was littered with corpses, their flesh a sickly gray beneath the pale moonlight, except for where the countless splashes of blood had fallen. No dogs, nothing moving except the low clouds scudding across the thickening night sky. Claire stood for a moment, watching the shadows, wanting to make sure of her surroundings before leaving the exit behind. "Steve," she whispered harshly, afraid to shout for fear of what might be lurking. Unfortunately, Steve Burnside was as scarce as the howling dog she heard. He hadn't just wandered away, it seemed. He'd taken off at a sprint. Why? Why would he choose to be alone? Maybe she was wrong, but Steve's bit about not wanting to be slowed down just didn't ring true. When she'd unknowingly stumbled into the raccoon nightmare, running into Leon had made all the difference in the world. They hadn't stuck together the entire time, but just knowing there was someone else as shocked and scared as she was, instead of feeling helpless and isolated, she'd been able to form clear objectives, goals beyond mere survival, finding transportation out of the city, looking for Chris, taking care of Sherry Birkin. And simply from a safety standpoint, having someone to watch your back is a hell of a lot better than going it solo, no question. Whatever his reason, she was going to do her damnedest to talk him out of it, assuming she could find him. The yard in front of her was much bigger than the one she'd just stepped out of. A long one-story cabin to her right, a wall without doors to her left, the back of a larger building perhaps. A low fire was burning in one of the wall's broken windows, and there was plenty of debris strewn among the dead, evidence of the forceful attack. To her immediate right was a locked gate, a moonlit dirt path on the other side, and the closed door, which meant that Steve was either in the cabin or had gone around it, using the trail at the far end of the yard that also headed to the right. She decided to try the cabin first. And as she hopped a few steps up the railed porch that ran most of the length of the building, she found herself wondering who had attacked Rockfort, and why. Rodrigo had said something about a special forces team, but if that was true, whose orders were they following? It seemed the Umbrella had its share of enemies, which was definitely good news, but the island attack was a tragedy nonetheless. Prisoners had died along with employees, and the T virus, perhaps the G virus too, and God only knows how many others, didn't differentiate between the guilty and the innocent. She had reached the plain wooden door of the cabin, and holding the 9mm at the ready, she gently pushed it open and immediately closed it. Her course decided by the two virus carriers she had seen inside, both stumbling around the table. A second later, there was a thump at the door, a low, pitiful moan filtering out. The trail of this, then. She doubted that the cocksure Steve would have left anyone standing had he gone into the cabin, and she probably would have heard the shots. Unless they got him first. Claire didn't like it, but the grim reality of her situation was that she couldn't afford to waste the ammo to find out. She'd follow the path, see where that led, and if she couldn't find him, then he was on his own. She wanted to do the right thing, but she also felt pretty strongly about saving her own ass. She had to get back to Paris, to Chris and the others, which she certainly couldn't do if she blew her ammo and ended up being someone's lunch. She moved back along the porch, all of her senses on high as she neared the end of the building. She hadn't forgotten about the zombie dog or dogs and listened for the patter of claws against dirt, for the heavy panting that she remembered from previous experiences in Raccoon. The damp, chill night was quiet, a shivering breeze sweeping lightly through the yard, the only breathing she heard her own. A quick glance around the corner of the cabin, nothing. Only a man's body lying half in and half out of the building's crawl space, some 5 meters away. Another 10 past that, and the path turned right again, much to Claire's relief. She'd seen that leg of the trail through the locked gate, and it had been empty then. So he must have gone through that door, the one on the west wall. It was also a relief to know something. It was also a relief to know something, to know anything certain when it came to Umbrella. She started down the path, thinking about what it would take to convince the macho teen to stay with her. Maybe if she told him about Raccoon, explained that she had some practice with Umbrella's disasters. Claire was about to step over the lone corpse's upper body when it moved. She jumped back, her semi pointed at the man's bloody head, her heart hammering, and she realized that he was dead. That someone or something in the shadows of the crawl space was pulling him inside by his legs, a strong and steady series of jerks, like a dog backing up with something heavy in its jaws. She didn't think anything after that, instinctively leaping over the dead man and sprinting away, aware that the dog, if that's what it was, wouldn't be preoccupied forever. The realization they had been less than a meter away lent her speed as she took the corner, her boots slapping against the wet, hard packed earth, her arms pumping. Zombies were slow, uncoordinated. The dogs that both she and Leon had run across were vicious and lightning quick. Even armed, she wasn't interested in facing off with one of them. A single bite and she'd be infected too. The gurgling howl came from farther away from the gurgling howl came from farther away than the crawl space, from somewhere back in the front part of the yard. Shit. How many? Didn't matter. She was almost there. Her salvation ahead on the left. Not daring to look back, she didn't slow down a step until she reached the door, grabbed the handle and shoved. It opened easily, and since she didn't see anything with teeth directly in front of her, she jumped in and slammed the door behind her, only to hear the multiple wails of zombies, to smell the feverish rot of the dying virus carriers, even as something crashed into the door at her back, began to claw at it, growling like some feral monster. How many dogs? How many zombies? The thought flashed through her panicked mind, the need to conserve ammo deeply ingrained after a raccoon. And what if I'm about to hit a dead end? She almost turned back in spite of the risk until she saw where the zombies were. The passage she'd entered was thick with gloom, but she could see several stumbling men locked in a cage area to her left, all of them pretty far gone. One of them was beating on the mesh door, its nearly skeletal hands hanging with ribbons of damaged tissue, oblivious to the pain of its disintegrating body. Must be the kennel. Claire took a few steps further in, focusing worriedly on the simple and somewhat flimsy lock holding the door closed, and saw the three uncaged zombies just as the first was reaching for her, its gaping mouth dripping with saliva and some other dark fluid, its bony fingers stretching out to touch her. She'd been so intent on the caged creatures, she hadn't realized there were more of them. She reflexively dropped her weight and snapped her left leg into its chest, a solid and effective sidekick that knocked the creature back. She could feel her boots sink into its deteriorating flesh, but didn't have time for disgust, already bringing the 9mm up. And with a slim metallic crash, the kennel door banged open, and suddenly she was facing 7 up instead of 3. They crowded toward her, clumsily maneuvering past the dumpster, a few barrels, the bodies of their fallen brethren. Bam! She shot the closest one without thinking, a neat hole punching right through its right temple, understanding that she was doomed as it crumbled and hit the dirt. Too many, too tightly grouped. She'd never make it. The barrels. One of them was marked flammable. Same trick I used in Paris. Claire dove for cover behind the dumpster, switching the gun to her left hand as she landed the target marked in her mind's eye. She came up shooting, only her arm curling around the dumpster as the confused zombies teetered and searched, moaning hungrily. Bam, bam, kablam! The dumpster slammed into her right shoulder, knocking her over backward. She curled into a ball on her side, ears ringing as jagged, burning shreds of metal rained down from above, clattering atop the dumpster, a few of them landing on her left leg. She slapped them off, scarcely able to believe that it had worked, that she was still alive. She sat up, pushing herself into a crouch, looking out at what remained of her assailants. Only one of them was still whole, leaning heavily on the kennel, its clothes and hair on fire. The upper body of a second was trying to crawl toward her, its blackened, bubbling skin sloughing off as it inched forward. The rest were in pieces, the burning earth looking up to claim the pathetic remains as its own. Claire quickly dispatched the two left alive, her heart aching a little at the dismal end these people had come to. Ever since Raccoon City, her dreams were haunted by zombies, by the stinking, dripping creatures that sought live flesh as sustenance. Umbrella had unintentionally created particular these particular monsters like nightmarish walking corpses straight out of the movies, and it was kill or be killed. There was no choice. Except they were people not so long ago. People with families and lives who hadn't deserved to die in such terrible ways. No matter what evils they may have committed, she looked down at the poor burned bodies, feeling almost sick with pity and a low but insistent fever of hatred for Umbrella. Claire shook her head and did her best to let it go, aware that allowing herself to carry all that pain might make her hesitate at some crucial moment. Like a soldier at war, she couldn't afford to humanize the enemy, although she had no doubt as to who the real enemy was, and she hoped fervently that Umbrella's leaders would all burn in hell for what they'd done. Not wanting to be surprised again, she carefully and thoroughly checked the passage's shadows in her evaluation of next step choices. In the back of the kennel was an actual guillotine, stained with what appeared to be real blood. Just looking at it made her shudder, reminding her of RPD's Chief Irons and his hidden dungeon. Irons had been living proof that Umbrella didn't run psych tests on their undercover employees. Behind the nasty execution device was a door. But Steve obviously hadn't gone that way, not with the zombies locked in. Next to the kennel was a kind of metal sliding shutter, but it wouldn't open. And next to that, the only door he could have gone through, because the passage was a dead end just past it. Claire walked to the door, suddenly feeling very tired and very old, her motion spent. She checked the handgun and then reached for the handle, absently wondering if she would ever see her brother again. Sometimes holding on to her hope was a tremendous burden, made all the heavier because she couldn't set it aside, not even for a moment. Steve jumped when he heard the explosion outside, reflexively looking around at the small cluttered office as though expecting the walls to crumble. After a few beats, he relaxed, figuring it was probably just another heat blast. Nothing to worry about. Ever since the attack, the unchecked fires burning throughout the prison compound occasionally rolled over something combustible, a canister of oxygen, or kerosene, or whatever, and then kablooey, another explosion. It was just a blast that had kept him alive, actually. He had been knocked out by a flying chunk of wall when an oil barrel had blown up, debris covering him completely, hiding him. When he finally come to, the big zombie chowdown was pretty much over. Most of the prison guards and the prisoners already dead. Bad train of thought. He shook it off and returned his attention to the computer screen, to the file directory he stumbled across while trying to find a map of the island. Some dumbass had written the passcode number on the sticky note and slapped it on the hard drive, giving him easy access to some obviously secret stuff. Too bad most of it was dull as dishwasher. Prison budgeting, names and dates he didn't recognize, information about some kind of special alloy that metal detectors couldn't pick up. That one was kind of interesting, considering he had to walk through a two-way lockdown metal detector to get to the office, but 3 or 4 well-placed bullets to the mechanism had taken care of that. Good thing, too. He found one of the main gate emblem keys tucked in the desk drawer, which would definitely have triggered a lockdown on his way back through. All I need is a goddamn map to the nearest boat or plane, and I'm history. He'd pick up the chick after he cleared a path too, played the knight in shining armor, and she'd undoubtedly be appreciative, maybe even enough to want to. A name on the file directory caught his eye. Steve frowned, peering closer at the screen. There was a folder labeled Redfield C. As in Claire Redfield? He tapped it up, curious, and was still reading, totally absorbed, when he heard a noise behind him. He scooped his gun off the computer and spun around, mentally kicking himself for not paying better attention. And there was Claire, her own weapon pointing at the floor, a slightly irritated look on her face. "What are you doing?" she asked casually, as if she hadn't just scared the crap out of him. "And how did you get past the zombies outside?" "I ran," he answered, annoyed by the question. Did she think he was helpless or something? "And I'm looking for a map. Hey, are you related to a Christopher Redfield?" Claire frowned. "Chris is my brother. Why?" "Siblings. That explains it." Steve motioned toward the computer, vaguely wondering if the entire Redfield clan kicked ass. Her brother sure as hell did. Ex-Air Force pilot and STARS team member, a competition marksman, and a serious thorn in Umbrella's side. No way he would have admitted it out loud, but Steve was kind of impressed. "You might want to tell him that Umbrella's got him under surveillance," he said, stepping back so she could read what was on the screen. Apparently, Redfield was in Paris, though Umbrella hadn't managed to locate his exact whereabouts. Steve was glad that he'd run across a file that meant something to her. A little gratitude from a pretty girl was always a good thing. Claire scanned the info and then tapped a few keys, glancing back at him with a look of relief. "Thank God for private satellites. I can get through to Leon. He's a friend. He should have hooked up with Chris by now." She'd already started typing, absently explaining herself as her fingers moved across the keys. There's a message board we both use. There, see? Contact ASAP, the gang's all here. He posted the night I was caught." Steve shrugged, not really interested in the life and times of Clara's pals. "Go back a file. The longitude and latitude of this rock are written down," he said, smiling a little. "Why don't you send your brother directions? Let him come save the day." He expected another irritated look, but Claire only nodded, her expression dead serious. "Good idea. I'll say there's been a spill at these coordinates. They'll know what I mean." She was pretty, all right, but also pretty naive. "That was a joke," he said, shaking his head. They were in the middle of nowhere. She was staring at him. "Hilarious. I'll tell it to Chris when he shows up." Entirely without warning, a fiery rage welled up inside of him, a tornado of anger and despair and a whole bunch of feelings he couldn't even begin to understand. What he did understand was that little Miss Claire was wrong. She was stupid and snotty and wrong. Are you kidding? You actually expect him to show with what's going on here? And look at the coordinates. The words came out hot and fast and louder than he intended, but he didn't care. Don't be such an idiot. Believe me, you can't depend on people like that. You'll only get hurt in the end, and then you'll have nobody to blame but yourself. Now she was looking at him like he'd lost his mind, and on top of his fury came a crushing wave of shame that he freaked out for no good reason. He could feel tears threatening, only adding to his humiliation. There was no way he was going to cry in front of her like some baby. No way. Before she could say anything, he turned and ran, blushing furiously. Steve, wait! He slammed the office door behind him and kept going, wanting only to get out, to get away. Hell with the map. I've got the key. I'll figure something out and I'll kill anything that tries to stop me. Through the long hall, past the dead metal detector and out, his weapon ready, a part of him bitterly disappointed as he ran past the kennel, twice nearly tripping over wet and smoldering body parts. There was nothing to shoot, no one to blast into oblivion, to make him stop feeling whatever he was feeling. He barreled through the door that came out behind the bunkhouse and started around the long building, sweating, his heart pounding, his thick hair sticking to his scalp in spite of the cold air. And he was so focused on his own strange madness, his need to run, that he didn't see or hear anything coming until it was almost too late. Wham! Something hit him from behind, knocking him sprawling. Steve immediately rolled into his back. Into his back? Steve immediately rolled onto his back, a sudden mortal terror blocking out everything else. And there were two of them. Two of the prison guard dogs, one of them circling back from having jumped on him, the other growling deep in its throat, its legs stiff and head down as it slowly approached. Jesus, look at them. They had been Rottweilers, but not anymore. They had been infected. He could see it in their glazed red eyes and dripping muzzles, and the strange new ridges of muscle that flexed and bunched beneath their almost slimy-looking coats. And for the first time since the attack, the immensity of Umbrella's craziness, their secret experiments, their ridiculous cloak and dagger mentality really hit home. Steve liked dogs, a hell of a lot more than he liked most people, and what had happened to these two poor animals wasn't fair. Not fair. Wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't deserve any of this. I didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't even aware that the object of his pity had changed. That he was admitting to himself how shitty things really were, how badly he'd been screwed. He didn't have time to notice. It had been less than a second since he'd rolled onto his back. The dogs were getting ready to attack. It was over in another second. The time it took to pull the trigger once, pivot, pull it again. Both animals went down instantly, the first taking it in the head, the second in the chest. The second dog let out a single yip of pain or fear or surprise before it collapsed in the mud, and Steve's hatred for Umbrella multiplied exponentially with that strangled sound. His mind repeating again and again how unfair it all was as he crawled to his feet and broke into a stumbling run. He had the key to the prison gate. He wasn't going to be their captive anymore. Time for a little payback. Time for a little payback, he thought grimly, suddenly hoping, praying that he crossed paths with one of them, one of the sick decision-making asshole bastards who worked for Umbrella. Maybe if he got to hear them beg for death, maybe then he'd feel a little better. Okay, I think, that was chapter 3. I'm kind of curious, like in the actual game itself, how, because here we get, or at least the characters, we can get into the character's head, because having the characters suddenly disappear twice after just meeting up again. On one hand, it's kind of hilarious, but I can understand playing a game, depending on how constant this happens. I have not played this game, and I don't remember much of the story here. How annoying that could be. But okay, so that was chapter 2 and 3. Can't remember. There were well, okay, I was about to say how many chapters there were, where I couldn't remember how many chapters there were. At the same time, doesn't matter because I wasn't kidding. One of the chapters, I swear to you, were just 2 pages. So you're going to be seeing, as I'm reading this, there's going to be like a sudden jump in how many chapters I go through. But either way, we're going to end this reading session here. So thank you for liking if you liked. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys, see ya. And the stream will end.